All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to discuss this. A Glock 19 Gen 5 chambered in 9mm. This is our latest entry in the Friendly Fire series, a series where I review guns out of the collections of my friends in order to discuss whether or not I would buy them and what changes I would make if I did, or also what purposes they would satisfy for me. So, let's go ahead and get into the history on this particular handgun. Now, keep in mind, guys, Glocks are a weird combination of not terribly historic firearms, but also items of a source of great discussion for an awful lot of people. So there's a lot of rabbit holes that we're potentially going to fall down during this, and I do apologize in advance. If I'm taking too long through any particular section, go ahead and hop into the description, check out the chapters tab, and hop to where it is that you actually want to watch or pick back up on the video. Now, 1986, Glock handguns hit American shores, first with the Glock 17 Generation 1. And this would come into a lot of fanfare and controversy, especially since these are kind of the first widely available polymer frame striker-fired handguns in the United States. Some of the first, and they would wind up eventually becoming very popular. Now, by the late 80s, the Generation 2 would be online. Now, some Generation 1 Glock 19s were produced. However, it is a solidly Gen 2 product and has existed in the Glock product line ever since. A couple of things to keep in mind about Glock nomenclature, by the way, guys. This is something that I run into a lot. I like how Glock does their nomenclature because it is very simple. So the Glock 17 was Gaston Glock's 17th patent, and everything after that has been in order of production or in order of release. Now, that's really easy if you know the order of release for Glock handguns, but it's also really difficult if you don't know that. So this causes a lot of confusion, especially if you have the kind of casual gun owner who maybe has the tendency to refer to handguns and rifles by their caliber and not necessarily nomenclature. So if you come up and tell somebody that you just bought a Glock 45, they'll be like, "Oh, great, 45 handgun, that's really great, stop power, blah, blah, blah." Where you're talking about a 9mm handgun, and that would be very confusing to that person. Or you say, "Hey, I bought a Glock 45," and somebody who does know a little bit about Glocks goes, "Well, okay, which one? The 21, 41, 36, 30, like which one did you buy?" And you're like, no, the 9mm. And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." And I see this a lot in gun shops and stuff like that because people in gun shops wind up dealing with both the casual and the more learned shooter. So there's always this kind of stutter step whenever you're talking about these different handguns and their designations, and you're trying to figure out what it is that this person is trying to talk to you about. So in this case, the Glock 17th patent. The Glock 18 was the full automatic version, machine pistol version of the Glock 17, and then you got the Glock 19, which is the compact version. Now, when these started coming in, I am curious to really reach back on some research and see how these were accepted at the time, because the 19 coming in the early 90s is kind of missing the boat on an awful lot of things. We're just coming off of the Miami-Dade County shootout in 1986, if I remember correctly. And the 9mm is on the outs with an awful lot of law enforcement agencies at that point because they performed abysmally in that little shootout. The 40 Smith & Wesson is online or about to come online. Everyone's looking at 10mm, 45 stopping power discussions going on out there. 9mm is kind of getting kicked to the curb because it's not really producing the fight stopping characteristics that it needs to. But on the other side of that, it is still a fairly inexpensive round to be able to shoot and train with, and it has capacity on its side. So that's where the argument originates between 45 and 9mm. Well, 45 has better fight-stopping characteristics, and 9mm has more capacity, so I can put more holes into something. And this back and forth, this ebb and flow keeps going. So obviously, I was born in '89. I was very young when this handgun hit the country, so I can't really speak to that very well. Then in 1994, you have the assault weapons ban, which included a magazine capacity ban, which then takes the advantage of a 9mm handgun and kind of removes it. Now you're stuck to 10 rounds. You have just as much capacity as a 40 or a 45. The only advantage that the 19 has at that point is that it's lighter and it's smaller, while still managing to maintain 10 rounds. It's a little less snappy than a .40 Smith & Wesson, which is an advantage in a smaller overall platform, but you could definitely see how this is a topic of debate, and I don't necessarily think the 19 establishes an immediate superiority over other options on the market. Now, the assault weapons ban would go on for about 10 years, and all throughout that, quite a few things would change. How we train around firearms would change. How we conceal carry and the availability of concealed carry friendly locations would also change. When it sunset in 2004, the assault weapons ban, mind you, when it sunset in 2004, you would see a very different shooting landscape on the horizon and us segueing into that in the early 2000s. And the Glock 19 really started to take off at that point. First off, being a good kind of in-between sized handgun, which is what it's often talked about, it's very easy for this to become a one-size-fits-all solution. You can wake up in the morning, take this off of your bedstand, your nightstand or something like that, put it in your concealed carry holster, go into work. Maybe you are in some type of profession that requires you to carry a firearm, so once you get to work, this goes from your concealed carry holster into your duty belt. You carry it all throughout your shift. You go back to the locker room, you put this thing into your concealed carry holster, you take it home, you put it on your bedside, you go to sleep, rinse and repeat the next morning. This handgun becomes the only gun you need, as someone might say. Take into account the cheaper ammunition, which means that you can spend more time training, and advances in bullet technology allowing 9mm projectiles to actually get optimal fight-stopping characteristics, FBI standard, penetration and expansion and all that kind of stuff. The Glock 19 quickly starts to find itself to be a very popular tool, looking at continued adoption by government and local, federal and local agencies and all that kind of stuff, law enforcement agencies all over the country, let alone all over the world, were switching over to Glock 19s. Special forces, specifically Green Berets and Navy SEALs, started running Glock 19s. And this really kind of builds this rapid explosion of popularity with the Glock 19 to where it becomes just a standard. And as much as a lot of people might argue about Glocks and the Glock 19 specifically, the fact that it became an industry standard is impossible to avoid. This was a top-selling handgun. This was one of the most popular handguns in concealed carry holsters, competition holsters, duty holsters, all around the country and the world for that matter. It's hard to argue with those results. Now, does that necessarily mean that it's the best? Well, sometimes when you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. And that is sometimes the case with this particular handgun. We can discuss that further a little bit later on. But regardless, the Glock 19 has definitely carved out its niche in the market. Now, this is the Gen 5, which came out in 2017. And we'll kind of discuss some changes that occurred over time to get to this particular handgun. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers features. Why don't we go ahead, pretty much covers history. Why don't we go ahead and start discussing features? So, right off the bat, we have a 3.75-inch barrel, and this is Glock's new Marksman's barrel, which has a slight change to the polyagonal rifling and has a slightly crowned muzzle. Now, this is supposed to make this this super accurate handgun shooting like 2-inch groups at 50 yards or something like that. However, a couple discussions go on with that. I don't get broken up about handgun accuracy. And maybe this puts me in the minority in the firearms community, but I don't think it's a terribly interesting conversation. And that's primarily because handguns are short-range options. Your average self-defense engagement is supposed to be between 15 and 21 feet. And I would consider maybe pushing a handgun to 25 yards for a realistic engagement distance. Anything beyond that is because it's all I have. If I'm taking a shot on somebody at 50 yards with a handgun, I'm laying down like suppressive fire or something like that. This is a Hail Mary shot because I have no other option. Perhaps they have a more capable weapon system and I am stuck in a position where I cannot break contact and get out of there. So I'm working with what it is that I got. If that's the case, then cool, I guess that works out. But I don't think it's terribly beneficial to the vast majority of shooters. So I don't consider the Marksman barrel to be a pivotal selling point. I don't think the average shooter will be able to tell the difference between any other Glock barrel and the Marksman barrel, personally. Now, we will note that the front of the slide is now beveled. And this is actually something that was originally introduced on the baby Glocks, the 26 and 27 subcompact Glocks. See there, that beveling. And the idea here is that it's supposed to make it easier to reholster the gun. Now, when the Gen 5s first hit the market with this beveling, they did not bevel the frames. Now, did that impact performance? No, not at all. However, it was still really irritating from a fitment standpoint that you had this blocky square frame and then a beveled slide, and that bevel did not go all the way down through the frame. That annoyed me when I first looked at it. It's just aesthetics, but it's really simple aesthetics. And you're telling me a company like Glock that has contracts out the wazoo and is raking in the funds can't spend a little bit of time and money to bevel it the first time? Now, of course, this is a later production or more recent production Glock 19, and we can see that the slide is beveled. So they fixed it. They went back and fixed it. It just irritates me that they had to go back to fix it. Now, in addition to that, we have on this gun the standard Glock sights, which are generally hated, and I have to say that I agree with that. Once upon a time, I defended Glock sights, these plastic factory sights. I defended these. And to caveat off of that, to defend my defending of them when I was still of that opinion, I do think that you can take these sights out of the box, you can take this gun out of the box, and you can probably pass any qualification at any law enforcement agency with them. However, for long-term use, I do not think they are good. And specifically, when I decided to stop defending these sights was when I took my Glock 34, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. When I took that to a pistol course and I went to rack my rear sight off of my boot doing one-handed manipulations and suddenly had the uncomfortable realization that doing that could result in me not having a rear sight. At that point, I made the decision that plastic sights were a higher priority for me to swap out. Now, whenever I buy a Glock handgun, the first thing that goes are those plastic sights. I get rid of the plastic sights before I get a holster. That is the order that this goes in now. Now, you can get these without the plastic sights. As we can see here on this Glock 19M, which came with Ameriglows, night sights, made of steel, the way they should be. All right, so now Glock also changed their slide finish on the Gen 5s. They went to an NDLC coating. I can't honestly say that I've ever really had an issue with Glock finish. If I'm being completely honest, I've never really seen it not hold up all that great, on the slide at least. Some people complain about the Gen 4s. I'm sure some people complain about the Gen 3s. And there's probably someone out there complaining about the finish on the Gen 5s. But honestly, it holds up, and these are Judy type guns. I expect them to get beaten up. Now, something that I will say for the earlier generation Glocks, those finishes held up because, now you see a lot of police turn-in type guns, and they still look pretty good, even though they've been riding in a holster and they've been getting beaten and bounced around and all that kind of stuff. And they look fine. So hopefully these hold up in the same kind of way. All right, now you'll note here that we have front cocking serrations. On the early generation Glock 19 Gen 5s, we did not have, or really the Gen 5s in general, we did not have front cocking serrations. Now, a lot of people like to really debate the pros and cons of front cocking serrations, and a lot of times price is cited. They don't like the idea that there's an additional cost tacked on for something that they don't consider to be that helpful. I could understand that completely. However, I don't think you necessarily lose anything by having them available to you. And a lot of this comes down to the idea of press checks, which is another topic that a lot of people really like to debate. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because anything that I have to do in order to be able to verify that this gun is loaded at the time that prior to the time that I need it to be loaded, is a necessary function. It doesn't necessarily have to be every 5 minutes, but if you were for some reason concerned about it, it is too easy off of front or rear serrations to check that real fast. I have done it, and I've seen plenty of other people do it. They step up, they step up on a shooting stage at a competition, or they step up to do a drill at a class or something along those lines, and their gun comes out and they get a click, no bang. Now, on a competition or a shooting stage for a course, you might feel silly, a little embarrassed, whatever, or you rack through it and you get right back into what it is that you're supposed to be doing. You get some free training on that. However, in a self-defense situation, that click would be deafening. And any amount of time that you're not spending in that gun, should it come out, any amount of time that you're not spending engaging that target is time that's potentially detrimental to you. So I don't care how it is that you verify that you've got a round in the chamber, do it. Press check, whatever. All right, now one thing that I will say about these slide serrations is that the front slide serrations are pretty much just the rear side serrations, and like somebody copy pasted them onto the front, which I find kind of funny. But I mean, they work. All right, now with everything since the Gen 3 Glocks have a loaded chamber indicator, which is a protrusion here on the extractor. The idea being that if there's a cartridge case lip underneath the extractor, that's going to poke out. However, I do not consider this a viable loaded chamber indicator that is tactile. And that's one of the big things about loaded chamber indicators. They need to be visible and tactile. Now, though this does protrude off of the slide, you can theoretically feel that. I think it blends in with too many other textures on the side of the gun, specifically in relatively close proximity to the slide serrations, and I don't consider that tactile enough. I would never rely on that personally. I would prefer to, in low light situations, bring the slide back a little bit and physically feel the round of the chamber, or if the situation allows for it, hit it with my light and see that that tab is up. So that's where I'm at. If you want to work off of, if your way of knowing that the round is in the gun is by in some way utilizing that loaded chamber indicator, that's fine. But I prefer a more tactile approach to that, personally. Okay, now something else to keep in mind here, guys, is that there has been a change to the slide of the Generation 5 Glocks. Now this is my Generation 4 Glock 23. And if we look at the safety plungers, this side being the 19, this side being the Glock 23, we can see that there is a very different shape, one more ovular than the other. This causes a lot of Gen 5 parts to not work with Gen 4 guns and vice versa. That's a very important thing to keep in mind if you're looking to buy one of these guns and make a bunch of modifications to them. You need to check to make sure that your parts have interchangeability with the version that you have. Now, we also have the captive double recoil spring that was originally introduced with the subcompact Glocks and then became standard in the Generation 4. We do have a light rail on this handgun, obviously, with this one specifically having a TLR7 from Streamlight mounted on it, 500 lumen light. We'll talk about that more here in a second. Now we can see off of this 19 mic or 19M that we have a single Picatinny slot. This is new for the Gen 5s. These guns will work with both Picatinny accessible guns and Glock rail guns. It'll work with both styles of light. So that's pretty cool. That's a nice innovation for anybody who's wanting to run lights on their gun. If you're not running lights on your gun, the front of the trigger guard is textured if you're somebody who holds the front of the trigger guard to keep the gun stable. All right, looking at our pin design, we went from a 2-pin system on the Gen 4 to a 1-pin system on the Gen 5. Now, our slide release is ambidextrous on the Gen 5s as well, and this is something that I've noticed with all Glocks. Whatever finish it is that they put on these slide releases is garbage. It wears off so fast. It's ridiculous. This is a minor fitment issue. Like, once again, this does not impact the capabilities of the gun, but it really annoys me that this happens. Now, Is this a slide release or is this a slide catch? This is not a conversation that I normally get into because I overhand rack handguns. Not from some sort of idea of like, oh, well, gross motor movements because you're not going to be able to conduct fine motor movements in combat and all that kind of stuff. No, it's because it works on every semi-automatic handgun that I have. And I train with a lot of different platforms, so I'm looking for different types of commonalities in my manual of arms. Overhand racking is one of them. So, in my opinion, when it comes to slide catch or slide release, it should be able to perform both, which this can. Now, something else about slide releases, because I will admit that utilizing the slide release is the faster way to go from unloaded on a slide lock reload to loaded. It is a much faster, more streamlined method to go about it. However, I think it's very important that if that's the method that you choose, that it be accessible with your firing hand. It's one of 3 things that I feel has to be accessible with your firing hand. So in this case, on the Glock 19, it absolutely is. All right, let's talk about our trigger real quick. Glock supposedly upgraded the trigger on the Gen 5s. Comparing them against these other options that I have out here, I've got to be honest when I say that I don't really notice a difference. It's maybe a little bit lighter than this Gen 4s, but it didn't feel that different from the Gen 3s. Glock triggers are a source of a lot of argument. Some people don't mind them. Some people absolutely hate them. I don't mind them. I'm not really a trigger snob. I don't get too bent out of shape over triggers as much as I do acknowledge that some are better than others. And there are plenty of handguns out there that are better than Glock triggers. But I do think a stock Glock trigger to the vast majority of shooters out of the market is not a detriment. Could it use some polishing or some upgrading? Sure. And if you've reached a point where you feel like your capability has exceeded that of the handgun, then a trigger is a fantastic thing to upgrade and change about. But I don't think the vast majority of shooters in the world are really at that point as much as they just think they are. All right, now our magazine release is the same as the Gen 4. It's this nice wide button that can be reversed, unlike the Gen 3, this little tiny non-reversible button. Located at the heel of the trigger guard in the American style, as some like to refer to it as. Now, some of the big changes here with our grip. First off, the deletion of the finger grooves, which we had originally introduced in the Gen 3s and then kept on the Gen 4s. Now, the finger grooves have been a major source of argument for an awful lot of people. I've never been bothered by them, but I got to understand how somebody's fingers maybe don't perfectly match to the grooves. So with that being the case, if I were to make recommendations to someone, I would say go with no finger grooves, and then it's never really an issue. Now, grip-wise or texture-wise, that's always been a point of contention for me with Glocks. This has the same rough textured frame that was introduced with the full-time with the Gen 4s, was actually a short production with the Gen 3s, kind of a special edition thing. It is grippy enough. Like, I know it's there, it's in my hand. I've definitely handled guns that were much more slick, but it's missing texture where I want it. And this is actually a complaint that I level at the vast majority of the market. I would like more texture up here. We do have this kind of dish out here for our hand, but I keep my lower fingers fairly loose on the grip as it is. Whenever I'm like really into it. Sometimes I tighten up my grip real hard and kink the gun a little bit and that throws everything off. But when I'm aware of it, when I'm not like super stressed, I keep these fingers fairly loose. So a lot of my grip is coming from these upper fingers up here, and I could use some more texture for that. That'd be really nice. Now, there are lots of people who texture these grips on the aftermarket. They get in there with a hot knife or something like that and go ahead and add some texturing up high. That is a method that you can choose. It is one of the advantages of polymer framed handguns. Now, we also have the interchangeable backstrap system that was introduced with the Gen 4s, which comes with quite a few different backstraps, including beaver tail backstraps, which are my favorite. All right, let's talk about this grip angle real quick. A lot of people have a tendency to discuss the Glock grip angle, which it is quite different. You have this hump here on the frame, which kind of changes how your hand interacts with it. It's not nearly as natural as picking up a 1911 or a SIG, a lot of other handguns. However, if you talk to some like super high round count competition shooters, supposedly this handgun forces your arm and hand into a better position for shooting it. Now, keeping in mind that Glocks have a fairly low bore axis, I could believe that. Also, I generally find Glocks less flippy than other handguns with the more straight grip angle. Just something to take into account there. The straight grip angle definitely feels better in the hand. I can present a Glock no problem. It points very naturally for me. But I've also learned how to point a Glock. And I think a lot of this comes down to a discussion of what is it that you're trying to get out of this. So if you're looking to have just one handgun, just one, that's going to be your self-defense gun, your duty gun, your home defense gun, all that type of stuff. If you're looking to have just one, there's a lot of features I would prioritize before grip angle. But if you're stuck between two options that were comparable in cost, features, value, all those other things that I think are a little bit more important than grip angle, then what I would use as a tiebreaker in that case would be which one points more naturally for you, because that is going to be a question of how much time you're spent training to point with the handgun, as opposed to, all right, I've got pointing down, now I can work on the next thing. I can spend more time working on the next thing. That's how I would look at that. Now, if you're somebody who just has a bunch of handguns, maybe you only train around one, but the rest of them are just shooting for fun, I don't think grip angle really matters at that point, because you sound more like a collector or, somebody who wants to have some nostalgia type pieces lying around, and I don't think grip angle should really be your goal, just as a topic of discussion. All right, now, of course, Glock magazines, well renowned for being highly reliable. They went to an orange follower on the Gen 5, which is advantageous for both competition shooters and tactical type shooters to be able to tell whether they have a malfunction or an empty gun. You see lots of competition shooters go to colored. Wow, I just had a complete brain fart. Colored followers. There we go. Found it. All right, just had to reboot for a second. All right, now this, of course, will take any larger magazines as well, unless you're in a state that is limited only to 10 rounds, in which case you're stuck with 10-round mags. But this will take all the way up to the 33-rounders. All right, let's talk about this grip a little bit more with the flare at the bottom here. The Glock Gen 5s went to a flared magwell, which I actually really do appreciate, because I have a tendency to struggle a little bit sometimes with Glock magwells. I can work around it, I can figure out how to kind of index it and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to find the magwell, but this flared magwell does help out. Now, originally when I handled one of these, I really didn't like the flared magwell. I felt that it was disruptive to my grip. That was at a time where I was still death gripping a gun. Now that I've switched over to mainly gripping with my upper fingers, I don't notice it as much. It doesn't seem to be as big of an issue. Now, in addition to that, on the original, that's the Gen 4, on the original Gen 5s, you had this cutout on the front. And the idea here was that since you had the flared magwell, you couldn't necessarily grip the magazine from the sides if you needed to rip a magazine out on like a double feed situation or something like that. So with that being the case, you needed a new method to be able to do that. So on the original Gen 5s, this cutout was added to the front so that you could get your fingers up in there at the back of the magazine and the front of the magazine against that toe and rip it out. Now, a lot of people complain that this was uncomfortable against their grips, which I did have an early complaint about that as well. And this wound up getting deleted because of that. It got filled back in. It looks like a continuous grip now. However, it has cut down on your workable surface area to be able to rip out that magazine. You now primarily have to leverage against the back of the mag in order to be able to strip it. But you do still have a little bit of toe to be able to grip on the front as well. Now, some people are really mad about this. They feel that that's not an effective way to rip out a magazine, but it's not unusual to work around the toe of the magazine to rip it out. The 1911, the Browning High Power, all of those had exposed magazine toes coming out from underneath the grip, so that if you needed to, you could rip out that magazine if for some reason it got gunked up in the gun. And that's actually a big part of how I conduct reloads on my Browning High Power, because those don't drop free. So I've never understood why people trash talk that. Doesn't make any sense to me. It in theory should work. What's the problem? All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? Guys, we're talking about a Glock 19. It's vanilla. It's white bread. It just works. It shoots. I've had 0 malfunctions. Not a big shock. The gun's mostly accurate. I do hate these sights, especially if you compare them like Trijicon HDs or something like that. These sights they're not prominent. And you really don't notice it until you put it up to nice pistol sights. And then you're like, wow, those really suck. But they are workable. You can do it and all that kind of stuff. The gun points naturally for me, but I don't have a lot of trouble pointing different handguns. I get a couple practice reps in, and then I'm pretty much good to go. And I've got a very good feel for how it is that I need to grip a Glock in order for it to point naturally for me. This light, I am not a fan of this light. I do like that it's nice, small, compact. The owner appears to be very concerned to make sure that it stays kind of flush with the end of the muzzle, which is his preference. However, my issue is that this is the button type, and my pointer finger is just not long enough. I have to adjust my grip just a little bit and really reach for it in order to be able to activate that light. And the thumb is kind of the same deal. It's probably the easier of the options, but I don't love it. I would actually kind of prefer levers or something like that, as opposed to trying to utilize these buttons. For my hands, at least. Especially since this is set up for the owner. He's running no backstrap. I generally run the beaver tail backstrap, so that would actually put me even a little bit further behind that button. So, not necessarily my favorite setup. But to each their own. All right, so it's Glock. It shoots like a Glock. It's boringly accurate. It's boringly functional. These are good things to be boring. And this is something that a lot of people complain about. Like, oh, well, what does it do that's better than anything else out on the market? Well, it kind of established the market. And because of that, it's just the expectation that it's going to do these things. It created that expectation. Glocks didn't. Keep in mind, guys, I am a Glock fanboy. Like, I have loved Glocks ever since I was a kid. So I'm not necessarily going to trash talk the gun. I am not completely enamored with all the aspects I have developed as a shooter in that case, but it's really hard to argue with something that just works, and hating it because it just works just doesn't make sense to me. Is it fun or interesting? Is it something that I would necessarily default to as a carry option? Well, yeah, it would, because I know it's going to go every time. There's never a question. Would I buy one of these and take it out of the box and immediately go run it? Absolutely. So with that being the case, let's go ahead and get into recommendations, which I'm pretty sure are coming through pretty strong right now. This is kind of a Goldilocks gun. It does middle of the road on everything, and that may not necessarily be a good thing. As a concealed carry handgun, given the right conditions, this is a fantastic concealment option. However, it's also a tad large, and in a market that has gone over to micro, compact, high-capacity 9mm, this gun is less relevant. The only thing that I will say for this gun over those is that a little bit larger gun is easier to handle. It's easier to get a good grip on it. It's easier to get a good sight picture and all that kind of stuff, and proper presentation and all those types of things, which isn't to say something like a P365 or a Hellcat can't do the same type of thing, as much as there's something to be said for a little bit larger gun, if you can sustain it. With this being a little bit larger, if you're wearing lighter clothing, this may not conceal as well, and that might be a problem for you. Whereas if you're wearing a jacket, or you're in a more cold climate, this works for you every time, and there's not a whole lot of reason to not pursue a larger handgun at that point. My preference in concealed carry is to carry the largest gun I can. So 19s and other guns of this size hold an interest for me, but that doesn't mean that I carry them all the time. And if that becomes the difference between whether or not you carry it all the time, your ability to be able to conceal this, if that becomes the difference between armed and not, this gun's not helpful. That's a problem with being the master of none. So would I recommend it for concealed carry? Conditionally, given the right wardrobe and the right intent. Well, what about duty type use? Well, yes, this fills plenty of duty holsters, and I think for like a plainclothes policeman, this is an absolutely fantastic option. But in a more tactical situation where I am overt, I am in a uniform of some sort, everyone knows who I am or what it is that I'm there doing, I would again prefer a little bit larger duty-sized handgun. Now, the great thing is I can run larger magazines in this, so I can run the 17 rounders in this from a Glock 17 if I wanted to. But I wouldn't mind having a little bit more grip, a little bit more good weight with a little bit longer slide and all that kind of stuff in order to really be able to keep this gun on target. Does that mean I can't keep this gun on target? No, but a Glock 17 would be just a touch easier. I've known plenty of guys who had the option of both a 19 and a 17 for duty use available to them, sitting in their lockers, and they preferred the 17 for actual hard duty use. But that doesn't mean you couldn't use this for that, just as much as to put it into context of Goldilocks. Still not the master of all. So, what about competition type use? Well, yes, and especially since there's a wide variety of aftermarket options for this handgun, you could get this tricked out and do all kinds of fantastic competition things. But wouldn't that be a great time for maybe a long slide or something along those lines so that it recoils a little bit more flat, maybe with less modification, not necessarily putting you in a position to compete against people with better options and all that kind of stuff. Something to consider. Again, master of none. But it could perform any of these capacities exceedingly well. I would be confident in this handgun in any of those options. It just wouldn't necessarily be my default. But if I could only have one, this is not a bad choice. But neither is an M&P9 or an HK VP9 or a lot of other polymer frame striker-fired handguns. You can't go wrong in that market for the most part. Maybe XD, but for the most part. To each their own, to each their preference, whatever it is that you want to get. But a handgun in this size anywhere in the market is going to work in all of those capacities. The one thing that Glock has over everybody else is aftermarket support, because you could completely rebuild this handgun and grow with it in a manner that is not achieved by very many other products available on the market. And that's a really big selling point to an awful lot of people, myself included, when it comes to Glocks. All right, so with that, would I buy this? Yes, but there's some conditions. First off, I'm in no rush. When it came to compact Glocks, I made my choice a long time ago with Glock 23, and though I sometimes kind of wish I went with the 19, I see no real need, no real rush to change it. Even though it's a Gen 5, I don't think that Gen 5 has anything going on that means that you have to replace whatever Glock it is that you already have, whatever generation it may be. If it was... I have considered many projects that a Glock 19 would be very fantastic for. However, for those projects, I've selected other handguns, and that's upcoming content. But I would have chosen this. I have served alongside the Glock 19, and actually here most recently in a Gen 5 context. So I have worked around this gun before, and for that, I would more than willingly add this to my collection out of nostalgia. But again, I'm not necessarily in a rush to add one to the collection because they are very available, and it's not like they're disappearing anytime soon. All right, so if I got it, what would I do to it? Well, as we already know, these sights would come off immediately. I'd probably get some like Trijicon HDs or something like that. I would probably run more like a TLR1 light or something along those lines, and then get a light bearing holster that goes along with it. And this would be kind of like a serious use concealed carry gun. I'm maybe traveling abroad and I don't know what kind of situations or scenarios I might get myself into, so I want the flexibility of a weapon mounted light maybe good to be able to use as a hotel room, bedside gun, something along those lines. Very adaptable for my travels. This would be the gun that I would pick for that. That would be how I would utilize this myself. In addition to competitions training, general plinking, all that kind of stuff. Really can't go wrong with this setup. All right, guys. This has been one of the longer videos that I've done in a while. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. If you want more interaction with this content, you want to discuss things with like-minded people and maybe see some behind-the-scenes stuff or some upcoming content, then you should totally check out the Murph's Law Facebook page. The link will be in the description. And with that, that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.